Start with some reflections from your time as the initial COP president. And when you were appointed to the role, you said that we could have the most ambitious COP ever. What did you mean by ambitious? And why were you so confident that we could meet that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would it help if I just gave a 1-minute summary of what COP is and what COP isn't? Because until I became the president, to be honest, having been the minister and attended several COPs, it was still not clear to me what COP actually did. So the COP process, which stands for Conference of the Parties, was set up after the Rio Earth Summit in 1991, at a moment where the world came together, governments came together and said, we have to develop in a more sustainable way. And the first COP was held in 1995 with Angela Merkel as the president. The COP is simply a gathering of representatives of governments with one aim, which is to negotiate a text, as many UN processes and indeed the G7 and G20 meetings are. So the whole process hinges on, can you create a communique that essentially achieves consensus? And what the COP is not, or historically has not been, is a place for all the activities and ambitions that are going on outside governments to come together and be challenged and added up. And it also is not a process that has any legal mandation. After the attempts made in the early noughties to create something that was a legally binding framework, in the run-up to Paris, the extraordinary leadership of the French government basically showed that in order to achieve a good outcome, you had to retreat from the idea of top-down measurement and anything that is legally binding into a bottom-up best efforts basis. That was the way to get countries to actually participate effectively in this process. So Paris was this hive point, if you like, of global diplomacy in the COP, in the whole history of COP. And it had focused on delivering an agreement that was simply a statement of intent, a recognition of the concern over climate change, and a statement of intent to work together, with three parts: a requirement for countries to come forward every 5 years with first of all, a single statement, a nationally determined contribution, and after that, a 5-year ratchet, a commitment on funds flows, because of course the big focus is how much money can the developed world give to the developing world for both mitigation and adaptation, and a focus on action, on what is called real world action, which always rather confused me because I wasn't quite sure how governments were outside the real world. And Paris extraordinarily joined all that together. But since Paris, what had happened had been a whole series of negotiations, which despite the best efforts of many very talented people, had not really achieved much. They had pulled together a Paris rule book, a framework for how you deliver this. And increasingly, and helped by the IPCC reports, there was a growing drumbeat out in the world that this was something that was incredibly important. Which brings me to the point about the Paris COP being so ambitious. 2020 was marked as the year where we had to stop essentially negotiating and start acting. This was the year where the Paris Agreement was supposed to come to life. And it was my belief, having identified the opportunity for the UK to host the COP, that we could have a massively important role in pushing forward the delivery of these updated NDCs, closing the Paris rulebook, making sure heads of state attended, but almost more importantly, using this COP moment as the big tent to bring forward all of this growing ambition, commitment, investment, and activity in the corporate sectors and in the financial sectors and out there in civil society. So that was the plan, that we would host this COP, we would use our track record in the UK of decarbonisation, of which we should be very proud, but we would work like stink to not only deliver a successful set of negotiations, and I'm very happy to talk more about what that means, but also we would dock in all of these other parts of the puzzle that have, I think, been ignored for too long. They don't have a natural resting home in the COP process, and we have to make one for them.
And if that's your definition of what the most ambitious COP could be for COP26, how likely do you think we are to achieve that, given where we are at the moment?
Well, it's helpful. So one of our challenges was in actually getting a COP team together, and you may want to ask more about that. But we were not well set up across government to pull together an extremely effective COP team. And my first port of call when I became the president-designate was to go and speak to the successful president of the Paris COP, Laurence Fabius, and say, what is it we have to do? And he shared various learnings. I wrote, because we weren't capable apparently of pulling one together across government, I wrote an action plan for COP26, which I believe is still largely extant. And I'd be very happy to share that with the committee as confidential written evidence, because it sets out exactly what we needed to do, both in terms of the negotiations and also in terms of the real world action. And there were 7 key points. The first was that we had to move from the vague definition of Paris compliant, which can be anywhere from an outcome of 1.5 to 2 degrees, and anywhere from an outcome of 2050 to 2099, to something that was a much more manageable landing zone for countries and for companies. And we picked the idea of the net zero COP as the mantra. We needed to basically get as many countries and sectors and cities and states to commit to net zero by 2050 or earlier, and really sharpen up this landing zone. And net zero, I mean, I brought in the net zero legislation for the UK. Net zero is a dirty word in some circles in the climate space, because it implies that you can net off emissions by using natural carbon sinks or technological means of carbon removal, and that you aren't going to focus hard enough on emissions reduction if you do that. And there is a raging debate that is still going on, actually. But the point of this was it was much easier to work to net zero as a landing zone. So this had to be the net zero COP. We had to get every head of state to attend. One of the great successes of Paris was the extraordinary efforts made by the Americans, by the Europeans in particular, to make sure that Mr. Modi attended from India, that we had a really good head of state attendance. And since then, it has not been a must-do visit for many heads of state. Indeed, at the Madrid COP, I believe only 30 heads of state attended, and some of those were there just for a few hours. So we had to have this real way of getting it to the head of the politician's inbox. The second was...
Sorry, Claire, can I just come in on you on the point about heads of state and the team structure? And we'll probably come back to the detail of the 7 points in further questions with you this morning.
Of course.
You'll know that the structure at the moment is that there's the Cabinet Office COP team, which is working at the moment very closely with the team in the BEIS department, because the BEIS Secretary of State is the COP26 president. And then the BEIS department has this kind of coordinating function across departments, and then feeds back up into the Cabinet Office committee, which feeds into the Downing Street committee with the Prime Minister. I'd be interested to hear your reflections on whether you think that's the most effective structure, and also specifically on the heads of state engagement. What role you think the Foreign Office has to play or is playing in that process as well?
Well, it is entirely up to the government how it wants to structure its COP efforts. And as long as those efforts are led from the top, are a whole of government priority, and play to whatever strengths we have externally and within domestically, then there is no right structure. The challenge we had was the COP unit was originally set up as an independent unit, reporting in through the Cabinet Office to the Prime Minister. And I, as a president, was the first non-politician to lead it. And that was exceptionally difficult for the Whitehall system to manage, because essentially it descended into a whole series of turf wars about budget and influence that were being expressed both by ministers and also by civil servants. And the result of that was a view that this could not be done. It had to be done within a department, and that BEIS, for whom which was providing the majority of the budget, was the right place. It is striking, I think, that the talents of the Foreign Office are very many, and I believe that actually, having seen very successful COPs work when led by the Foreign Office in other governments, I would like to think that those talents, and also the role of the Foreign Secretary, which is enormous, are being used adequately at the moment. And I can't comment because I haven't seen the latest, but I know that the diplomatic network we have is exceptionally strong, and the role of the climate attachés in that diplomatic network is enormously powerful.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to move on now to questions from colleagues, but we'll probably come back to some of the detail you've already raised. I'm going to move now to Alexander Stafford, who is hopefully on the screen. There he is.
Hi, Alex.
Hi there, Claire. Sorry about that.
Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again. Anyway, yes, good to see you. Anyway, I want to focus my questions really about the role of the Prime Minister in all this. So basically, when you were COP president, what discussions have you had with the Prime Ministers that you served under about the summit? And what was their level of involvement, interest? How easy was it to talk about this issue with them, in your opinion?
So we identified the opportunity to host the COP at the COP in Poland several years earlier, and basically Italy, who were going to be the COP president, said we don't think we're going to do it, or there was a sense. And I said, one of the first people I phoned was the then Foreign Secretary Boris, who's current Prime Minister, to say this ball is coming loose. It's extraordinary opportunity for us because we have this great net zero track record, and this is a great opportunity for us to have a post-Brexit renewal. And he was extraordinarily enthusiastic about that idea. By the way, the Bay's civil servants adamantly did not want to host the COP, and neither did the Treasury. And that took a lot of persuading, working with both the Foreign Secretary and also Prime Minister May, again, who was also extremely positive about this. We were able to create a very compelling narrative. So both the previous Prime Minister and the current Prime Minister were very, very positive about the idea of hosting the COP. There was a question, I think, about how much work, what actually was required to deliver a successful COP, and how much it would require political leadership. And it was striking, as I wrote in my letter to the Prime Minister, that having set up the COP, having created the COP units, the Cabinet Subcommittee on Climate did not meet once between that period and the period when my contract was terminated.
You mentioned that the various government departments were not supportive of COP. Why? What were the reasons against it?
Well, there is a view, and to share with you, so COP is owned by the parties. What that actually means is COP is owned by the negotiation teams who represent the governments. And in some cases like ours, those negotiation teams work very closely to their sponsoring departments. In other cases, they will be diametrically, or appear to be diametrically opposed to what their governments are actually saying in public. It is a very contentious and zero-sum process. And the view when I first suggested hosting the COP was that we would upset the negotiations apple cart if we were to host it, because we are seen as this, powerful northern country, and that this would be very difficult. We've managed to persuade people that wasn't the case. But one of the proposals I had for the negotiations was that we live stream them. It is extraordinary what is said and what is not said in those negotiation rooms, and how far it is removed from the real world demands. And I think suggesting things like live streaming the world's most important negotiations was very well supported by many, but not supported by others, particularly those who have been involved in the negotiations for many years. I don't underestimate the importance of the negotiations, but the COP is not owned by the citizens of the countries that the negotiators are sent to represent, in my view, and it should be.
Okay. Thank you. Moving back to some stuff about the Prime Minister, and you mentioned also in your letter, how surprised you were after things continued, that the lack of involvement in some ways. What should, in your view, the Prime Minister's role be in this? Not what happened, but what would ideal Prime Minister do and support you, or how much free rein would you have, a COP president should have, to get on with it themselves?
So ultimately, the COP president is up there to hold the gavel during the 10 days of the actual COP meeting. And in theory, the diplomatic efforts, this sort of leading from the front, should be something that is a cabinet-led process, a very committed Prime Minister, and also extremely committed, particularly diplomatic focus. And the ability to engage with other countries, to be very closely involved, not just in picking up the phone once every couple of months to have a chat with heads of state, but actually engaging in what is it that this is going to take. To have a case in point, there were conversations by the French Prime Minister around levels of military support and sales of particular goods and services to countries who may well have wanted to come forward with a less ambitious package at the COP. It really is a whole of government effort if we are to deliver something very focused. And and to his credit, the current Prime Minister, does pick up the phone, does get involved. What I think has been lacking is this sense of this being job number one for the government, because of course, both with Brexit and COVID, there are other extremely important jobs that need to be taken care of. And if I may throw in a supplementary point that may be of interest to Scottish colleagues, there was a very strong view, good morning Mr Brown, that this was an opportunity to show the UK's ability as four nations at its best, that we had four countries who were negotiating together but had their own very ambitious climate plans. And this was one of the reasons for the decision to host the COP in Glasgow, a sense that this was a very strong unionist moment. I think the original work with both the Scottish First Minister and, if I may, previous Prime Ministers was really poor. And we should have been going out there and involving previous Prime Ministers and the First Minister in an extremely serious diplomatic way and turning them into ambassadors for this exceptional event. And there were some very petty conversations about why that was not a good thing to do. And I do chalk that up as a failing.
Just picking up on that, are you saying that sort of failing happened before the previous Prime Minister or under the current Prime Minister?
Under the current Prime Minister.
Okay. Now, you've mentioned what the role of the Prime Minister, in your view, should be prior to actual event, COP. What should the Prime Minister's role be actually at COP? You said the COP President is holding the pen. What should the UK Prime Minister do, apart from, I presume, glad-handing lots of nice representatives to?
Well, they should be using straining every possible sinew to ensure that we get the politicians that matter to attend, so the heads of state of the largest emitting countries, that we are working with our Commonwealth colleagues, again, an extraordinarily powerful bloc, to make sure that those heads of state attend and are well treated, and essentially using any opportunity to also show the people of this country who are paying for the COP, this is £250 million of taxpayers' money we are spending, that this is something that is good for us to host. And I very much welcome the 10-point plan and the focus on green jobs. The original plan was to have a festival of green Great Britain, a four nations COP, if you like, of course with Italy as our COP partners. And I'm not aware of any plans for that process to go ahead. And I think it is a really big missed opportunity.
I mean, taking from some of your comments, I think, not putting words in your mouth, you seem a bit disappointed with maybe the way things are going.
No, that would be unfair. I think circumstances have, I think there was a really a misunderstanding of what was actually required to host what I think is the most important diplomatic event for the last 20 years and possibly for the next 20 years. I think there was a cavalier attitude to what was required, and basically a view that you could wing it with a few press releases and that would all be fine. To share with you that the Prime Minister's former chief advisor phoned me up to explain he didn't believe that the COP needed a president. And I explained that it was a UN statutory role and therefore we did need a president. There just did not seem to be any sense of what we were actually doing. This is a deadly serious diplomatic moment on which the future trajectory of CO2 depends. And I don't think that sense of gravitas had percolated through. I'd like to think it is starting to, and hopefully with the evidence of this great committee, you can give that a big push.
And you mentioned, obviously, the 10-point plan for green industrial revolution, and there's been quite a few other announcements in last week's spending review. Does that give you more confidence in where this government is currently going when it comes to COP and climate issues? Now we're sort of we're going through COVID, they can now focus more on the issues. And do you think that this sort of level of leadership at home and then the 10-point plan is enough to make those conversations happy at COP, to show that we are serious about climate?
Well, I think it's super welcome. The 10-point plan is great, and it's very much an extension of the green the green growth plan that we published in 2017. This whole of economy approach is fantastic. What I find it to be is quite retail. There are lots of good things that people can put on their leaflets. The tough thinking about how we're going to build an energy grid that supports some of these rollouts, the underlying thinking, I think, still needs to be developed. And of course, it's fantastic for us to show these net zero credentials and that we're serious. But in a way, the thing about COP is it is the axis of disagreement in COP is very much developed northern economies who've gone through their industrial revolution telling developing countries what to do and not giving them funding to do it. So there is a very interesting diplomatic play in COP. You need to show that you are ambitious, but you also need to show you are very committed to helping other countries with their transition. And if I may, I think the axing of the 0.7% budget, which under Minister Stewart's role had turned very much into a support mechanism for climate mitigation and adaptation, is a signal that perhaps is not aligned with an understanding of the role that we have to play globally. And the other thing I think we are not doing enough of is engaging with the EU and others who would like to create trading regimes that have carbon border tax adjustments. That is the only way we'll persuade the big emitting economies to decarbonise rapidly. And I believe those have been rejected out of hand by those who are seeking our future trade relationships as putting up unnecessary tariffs. So I think whilst we're doing well at home, I don't think we understand the role that we have to play internationally enough to really deliver this successful pivot. Because it's not about the COP, it's about, can you see the CO2 emissions curve start to inflect and go down?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nusrat Ghani, please.
Good morning, Claire.
Good morning.
Good morning. Hello. I want to talk to you.
There you are. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm very
nice
well,
to see you.
Thank you. I want to talk to you about the role of the President. You've just mentioned earlier on that the role requires gravitas and how key, the role of the President of COP is, and you felt that possibly that wasn't understood previously. Maybe you think it's still not understood now. You may want to comment. Do you think that the COP President is sitting in the right place, and do you think the person holding that role has the key qualities and skills required to do the job?
Well, so the template for a good presidency, as I say, for me was what happened in Paris, what happened in the run-up to Paris. And the advice from both the president and his chief civil servant at the time was, you need to relentlessly focus on the 3 or 4 things you want to deliver in COP, and that has to be your messaging throughout the whole year. That is what you have to do. So and of course that was what I was attempting to do, albeit in an unusual format of not having a department behind me. And of course there will be those that say that I, with my desire to live stream negotiations and actually create real outcomes, perhaps was departing too much from the role of presidents historically, and that may well be a fair criticism. I can't comment on the current president's capabilities. I know him as a former colleague who is highly dedicated and extremely committed. It seems to me that BEIS is swallowing an awful lot at the moment in terms of COVID response. And it is, I would imagine, very, very difficult to get enough mind share out of the leadership team in BEIS to really focus on what the COP can deliver. Thank goodness, in a way, it's delayed, because it does give us an opportunity to refresh and post the COVID wind down. Hopefully we can do some more. But I think this is, if we are going to do this, we have to get very serious about the whole of government commitment and the role of the president. And it may be that it's the president, as I say, holds the gavel. It may be that this is something that between the highest echelons of cabinet, it can be done. What I would say, though, is I do think using the First Minister and using former Prime Ministers and perhaps former Foreign Secretaries as ambassadors could be enormously helpful in this process. I really do believe this is something that everybody wants to be a success, and I would urge the government to put aside petty politics and bring in those people who've played an incredible role on the world stage historically.
Do you think, considering all the issues that you've raised, that the COP President could be a standalone minister? Do you think they will have enough power then to galvanise support from different departments? I
think, having tested that model, I think that is a recipe for massive Whitehall infighting, if I'm totally honest. I think you have to get a department and a Perm Secretary, particularly ones who have spending commitments for the COP, to be aligned. And so the idea of having a Minister of State doing it, or somebody who, as I was trying to do, with a standalone budget, I don't think that works in the current Whitehall structure. And I think, so for me, it is something, perhaps you have a person who is there in charge of the negotiations, but you basically now get the absolute SWAT team out there on the global stage, amplifying this messaging and making sure it's a huge success.
Thank you.
Claire, if you had to put the COP President somewhere in Whitehall, where would you put them? Would it be BEIS? Would it be the Foreign Office? Would it be the Cabinet Office?
Oh gosh, you're inviting me to upset former friends and colleagues. I mean, I have to say, I think the department that feels to me to have continued its focus, particularly on the international diplomacy, is the Foreign Office. And of course, there were some excellent secondees into the COP unit, like John Merton, former ambassadors who have been doing a great job. But it feels to me that would be a possible shift. Having said that, it was quite disruptive. The transfer of a presidency was not well perceived on the global stage. And I think what we need now is to be creating a huge sense of confidence and momentum. And I've talked a lot about the diplomatic effort in getting countries to show up with their upgraded NDCs. What we haven't really talked about is this real world action. Now, I made a lot of bad and some good decisions in politics. I think one of the best decisions I made was to hire Nigel Topping and Mark Carney as our climate action champions and our COP26 finance champion. And the work that they are doing is extraordinary in bringing together corporate commitments, states and cities, and also financial flows. And then that work may well sit best in BEIS. I mean, that is where the business support is. So again, this is, I think, an opportunity to kind of down some of the traditional Whitehall arguments about resources, and also, if I may appeal to some of the external help, I was very keen to recruit talent, for example, who had delivered the Olympics for us so successfully, and we were barred from doing any external hiring for the COP unit, and also subject to quite draconian headcount and various staffing metrics in a way, for example, that the no-deal Brexit unit was not. And I felt then, and I felt now, that that was a huge mistake. I'm pleased to see the Prime Minister's appointed one of his friends as the net zero business czar. I think doing some of that internationally and really forming that sort of SWAT team would be a great way to re-establish momentum.
And just to push you slightly further, you said there that it wasn't welcome when there was the change in COP presidency. Is the suggestion, therefore, that yet another change in the COP presidency at this stage would be a bad idea?
Yes, I think we have. So I think we were lauded for wanting to become COP presidents and for working so closely with Italy. The level of ambition that we had set out, which I will send to you as this is what this COP needs to deliver. We'd established a very high-profile group of friends of COP around the world, and this was seen as absolutely game-changing. When the staffing change happened, that was a sort of moment. And then, of course, information about the lack of engagement in many parts of government was not helpful. I think the 10-point plan has restored a lot of that. I also think the work that's going on the natural climate space led by Minister Goldsmith is really welcome. But we need to show the world that this is something we are deadly serious about and want to be a massive success.
Thank you for that. I'm going to go to Alan Brand now, please.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, Claire. Hope you're well.
Hi, Alan. Good to see you.
And you. Claire, see if we go to when your contract was terminated at the end of January, one aspect you highlighted was the UK's COP26 preparations were miles off track. So just wondering if you could highlight a couple of key issues that would illustrate that. Also, if you maybe advise if you think the COVID delay has actually been put to any beneficial use in terms of tangible gains since then.
Yes, thank you. So look, it may be the case that I was in too much of a hurry, but I was very seized of with our early messaging and devote all of our attention to delivering that over the period we had remaining, which was, of course, was less than a year, because this was a very accelerated presidency. And we were very slow to establish the COP unit. The COP unit did what Whitehall often does, which is recreate itself like a little amoeba that grows. So we didn't have a COP action plan, but we had invitations to set our year-end development goals. We didn't have a communication strategy, but we did have a staff newsletter. We were just not focusing on what needed to happen. And that was amplified by the election and by the lack of engagement from the cabinet. What we needed was the cabinet to basically say, this is a massive priority, go away and sort out your infighting and just get on with it. And that wasn't happening. So I felt that where we needed to be versus where we were at the end of January, we were miles off track. Having said that, COVID, I think, has provided us, everyone, with a breathing space. It's allowed diplomatic efforts, particularly from the EU, to bring China to a much better place. And it's delivered a new administration in the States, who I think will be much more climate positive. So from that sense, I think the world has changed dramatically in terms of the likelihood of a successful negotiated outcome at COP. And I hope it's given us a chance to establish ourselves a little more within government. I'm afraid I can't comment, Mr. Brown. It's been a long time since, I clearly speak to many former friends in the COP unit, but I wouldn't be able to comment on the level of progress towards the COP, towards the original action plan.
Okay, thanks. Obviously, it was quite high profile at the time in terms of what happened to yourself. What explanation were you given for the reasons of your dismissal? What was your response to this? But also, as we know, a source in the COP26 unit was reported as saying that you seriously underperformed as a diplomat, including at Davos and a ministerial visit to India. So, do you have a comment for that? I know you did the letter to the Prime Minister, and pointedly you mentioned Dominic Cummings and dark ops. So, is there anything else you want to add?
So the evidence, so I had just returned from the Raisina dialogue with emails and texts from the ambassador in India saying what a successful visit it was, how much it had reset the conversation about climate. The Davos work, I'd been there with the Chancellor at the time, and we'd agreed that we were really moving. So I don't know where that came from. I have no idea. So I was given 3 separate explanations for my dismissal, one of which was Whitehall can't cope with this unit. You are treading on too many toes. The fact that I've been allowed to go to Davos when other ministers hadn't provoked a lot of jealousy. So there were ministers sort of on the warpath. And we can't cope and we don't need a president, so you've got to go. And I said, well, we actually do need a president. Well, it'll just have to go into Bays then. And whoever is the Secretary of State can do it. And then I was given an explanation that I had not treated my staff well. There was I had been, several years earlier, one of my underperforming civil servants had raised a complaint which had been fully investigated by the Cabinet Office with nothing to find. And I pointed that out to the Prime Minister. And of course, in the light of the subsequent, information about what behaviour is tolerated in the Cabinet, that was quite entertaining. There was simply no explanation. I was terminated. I had a contract. There was no redundancy payment made. And as is, I fear the mark of the previous group in Number 10, there was accompanied by a sort of what attempted to be a public monstering of my reputation, which people who had worked with me and seen what we delivered over the years out of that portfolio, I think felt was a bit incredulous. And I was encouraged to sue for unfair dismissal. I was encouraged to sue for gender bias because there are very few women involved in this COP process. That is not my style, and it's not about me. It's about a successful outcome for COP. But it was a sign, I think, of the extraordinary ineptitude and amateurishness of those who should be doing a better job should have been doing a better job for the Prime Minister, and it did not help our international reputation at all.
Okay, thanks for that. In the same letter of response that you had the Prime Minister, you described internal Whitehall battles, and you've touched on that quite a lot this morning. So is there any particular departments that were in conflict, and is much of this driven by other individuals that were working for the government? So obviously you mentioned there about personnel.
I think Bays had a massive issue in that they were funding a lot of the COP. The core negotiations sit in Bays, and the Secretary of State and the then Permanent Secretary were basically set up a shadow COP unit, as did, I believe, the Foreign Office. So there was a lot of lack of acceptance that this COP unit actually needed to be a place where all of this activity was put together. The inexperience of some of those we hired in to lead the civil service part of the COP unit played out in poor management of those interdepartment relations, and also very poor management of our relationship with the devolved administrations. We ended up making some very large, costly errors between the Scottish and the Westminster administrations in the actual delivery of COP and the policing presence, and that was just not accepting what was happening. I'd like to think that has been resolved. I believe that relations are better, and of course we are now committed to delivering this in Glasgow, which I think is a great thing for the city. But again, it was just not understanding that this was an Olympic-style event that we had to deliver, far more important in terms of the world's future trajectory, and we were treating it a bit like amateur hour, despite my efforts and many others' efforts to try and professionalise it.
Okay. Funnily enough, recently you'll be aware the Prime Minister called devolution Tony Blair's biggest disaster. So, is that? Do you really think that there's still at the top a willingness to actually work with the First Minister of Scotland and move things forward?
I wouldn't want to comment, Mr. Brand. I mean, look, I'm a unionist, as you know, and I think we're stronger together. But equally, I think that the Scottish First Minister has been a very effective advocate of ambition in the climate space. There have been some very good policies in all of the devolved administrations, and it seemed to me that this was an opportunity to actually work together. I advocated very strongly for the First Minister to be given a role, for former Prime Minister Brown to be approached to take a leadership role, and these ideas were rejected as preposterous.
Okay, thanks. And if we just go back to the Whitehall internal battles, etc., is there any measure you think be put in place that actually would improve the cross-Whitehall coordination, both in COP26, but actually climate change policy?
So I believe, sorry for interrupting, I believe that the interministerial meetings are now happening. I believe the Cabinet Office is taking a more effective role, and that some of these, as we have got more comfortable with this process, this is starting to move forward in a better way. I've been thinking hard overnight, because I usually ask this question, would I put somebody back in Cabinet with a climate, I attended Cabinet clearly, would I make the Secretary of State position? And I would do that on the basis of the sort of climate recovery, that it's not just about the sort of doom and gloom that is associated with this, it is about seizing the economic opportunities that will accrue for cities, for states and for companies. And so but I don't think we need to do that to do a successful COP. We should be able to pull together. We also have the G7 presidency as well to prepare for. So there are opportunities to cross-fertilise both of those with this very positive climate messaging. And I hope it's calmed down and that the units are working a little more effectively. And I'd like perhaps some of your future other witnesses would be able to reassure you on that point.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. I'm coming now to Paul Howell, please. Paul.
Thank you, Chair. Nice to meet you, Claire.
Hello, Paul.
Hi. I'm going to go back to what you described earlier as the real world and come away from Whitehall for a little bit and just talk about the role of business, if that's okay. And there's two dimensions to that. There's the impact that business can have on the negotiations, and then there's the other side as to what business requires from the process in terms of trying to help it out. Now, you've nicely digressed as we've gone through this, so I don't want to repeat some of the points, but I think it might be useful for you to elaborate on some areas. About I know you've quoted about companies' ambition being greater than government's at times, and I wonder if you could just talk around that.
Yes, of course.
Subject a little bit, Claire, please. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think we're in a sort of evolutionary phase where, again, it was a sort of original construct of COP that this was all about governments pulling levers, and somehow we would have a series of regulatory alignments across the world that were legally binding with a global carbon price. And that would all be great. And I just think we're a very long way from that. We don't have the levers in the COP process to do that. But what we do have is a sense that now 70% of emissions are actually coming out of the corporate sector. The biggest emitting sectors, energy, oil and gas, cement production, heavy transport. These are corporate activities by and large, either in the publicly traded companies or in the state-owned enterprises. So I think this sense of when you pull the levers, you actually want businesses to start responding, and also subnational actors, the cities, the states, the metropolitan regions who have many devolved powers they can use. And so what we've sort of seen, and this is partly what my new organisation does, we've been in the sustainability space for 25 years, is that companies are not just setting net zero targets like governments, and in some cases legislating for them, governments have done that. They are setting the targets, the intermediate targets, the governance structure, the investment profile, and the transparency of reporting that we need to hold them to account. And increasingly, providers of debt and equity and secondary trading organisations are focusing on companies' ESG credentials as a way of differentiating their cost of capital and their share price. And so these signals are starting to emerge in the private sector that are so much stronger than the real signals that governments tend to care about, which is ballot boxes in the democratic world. And I and it is sort of humbling in a way when you sit in the sort of WBCSD council meetings and you hear the ambitions and the commitments of companies who are not, by the way, in the EU or the UK, where we have a carbon price and an ETS scheme. They're operating in countries that have none of that infrastructure, but they are determined to do this. I wouldn't for a second suggest this is all about the private sector and the markets. It has to be a public-private blend. But the COP has nowhere really for that action and that ambition to dock. The action days are seen as a sideshow for the negotiators. And, the sense of, well, what does this all add up to? What does this net zero private sector commitment mean? And how do we amplify it? And how do we use the best of the private sector's brain and innovation to deliver really rapid technology cost changes has not been focused on enough. And I think it is so massively important.
Okay, I think there's also like a development of that in terms of the opportunity to see good benchmarks. We all know that the private sector likes first mover advantage and things like this. That they're just trying to stimulate and share the good elements that the private sector sees to try and get more private sector engagement. Yeah, absolutely.
And if I may share an example, so the offshore wind sector deal that I negotiated, which was the world's first public-private deal where we asked the offshore wind sector to come forward with its cost reductions, its supply chain involvement, onshore manufacturing to the UK. I set a gender diversity target of 30% female workforce. And in return, we termed out the auction structure from the Treasury. So we were able to give them a 10-year view of offshore wind demand, and that dropped the cost of capital by half in that sector in a matter of months. It's incredibly powerful, and I don't think we join up those public-private conversations nearly enough. And as you say, companies are prepared to stand up and be held to account on this now in a way that I think was not imagined in Paris 6 years ago.
Okay, so is there anything you'd like to elaborate on what business actually would require from COP to help them to deliver on the net zero? Is it like mirror images of what went on in the wind sector, or?
Well, so interestingly, there's a lot of work going on at the moment with organisations like WBCSD, the World Economic Forum, and others to try and help sectors form these net zero sector plans. Because the other big sort of known thing now is it's all very well for a company to set their decarbonisation targets, but you need the whole ecosystem to decarbonise. Their suppliers, their logistics providers, their investors. You've got to have this ecosystem approach. And so that sectoral approach, we're trying to replicate that globally. And we'd like to bring some of those net zero sector deals to the COP as a way of showing what can actually be achieved. And also with very specific asks for governments. If you take hydrogen, which is, of course, the miracle molecule everyone now wants to talk about, we're not talking enough about hydrogen infrastructure, how we're actually going to store and transport hydrogen. And infrastructure is often very much a government-led development priority. And I think these conversations about what we actually need with specific countries in order to decarbonise, they won't happen at the COP. They won't. Currently there is no place for those conversations to happen. The COP will be countries setting their ambitions and then business saying, and we can help you achieve it. But I'd love to think that COP could be one of those places where those ratchet conversations actually happened.
Okay, and just taking, just as an easy example, your comment on hydrogen. Do you see, there's obviously, as you say, it's a flavour of the moment in terms of UK conversations. Is that something that can be encouraged more globally? Is it something that is already out there that I just don't know about? I mean,
Well, so the 10-point plan very helpfully had a good hydrogen commitment in terms of, we've been talking about hydrogen for years. I mean, this was something I talked about a lot in BEIS. This is the only known way to decarbonise steel, cement, these sort of hard to abate sectors. This is what you need for these high heat processes. But it's green hydrogen, particularly created from renewable energies, is fiendishly expensive at the moment relative to alternatives. So we need a lot of innovation. And we also need to work out how to decarbonise hydrogen production from gas. So it's a bit like the renewables conversation 15 years ago. Everyone says, yes, this is the answer. We could make an awful lot of expensive mistakes with it. But I think, again, a joined up approach, which the EU is doing with its Hydrogen Council. There are lots of companies involving in that. And I don't know what our level of involvement is with the EU conversations. I'd like to think that that was a very fruitful area because we absolutely could collaborate very effectively there in the reduction of that cost.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Just moving the conversation on, because I'm sure I'm going to get stares from the chair shortly. But in terms of something else you've touched on, which is the involvement of the Foreign Office and other parts of government in the trade negotiations and trade envoy appointments and things like that, can you talk about how that becomes an asset in this process?
Yes, thank you. I mean, so one of the big conversations is, if you look at the scale of our emissions, the UK's emissions are less than 1% of the total and dropping very rapidly, as you'll know. Emissions were this low when Queen Victoria was on the throne, was one of those stats we used to use. The EU is dropping their emissions substantially as well. But China's emissions are the equivalent of America plus the EU combined. India's emissions are bigger than the OECD. So the battle for the change in the shape of the CO2 curve is not going to be fought in Northern Europe. It's going to be fought in the big developing countries of the world. And that, I guess, gets to this problem about what are the right levers to pull and who is the right person or who are the right organizations to do that. And one of the key tools is, if we know that China is a coal-dependent country, as is India, that's, who am I? I started the Powering Past Coal Alliance, but the ability for these countries to shift off coal is very difficult. But of course, they're producing goods for the West in that. So the idea of having a carbon border tax adjustment that would penalize products made in high carbon environments and also support domestic products that were being produced in these decarbonized ecosystems is really attractive. And indeed, it's being discussed in the US. When I spoke to John Kerry a couple of weeks ago, this was something on their agenda, and it's being discussed in the EU. My sense is that the current focus in our free trade, post-Brexit free trade arrangements does not include this. And indeed, it would be seen as a negative. It will be seen as an additional tariff. And certainly, given our desire to forge these post-Brexit trade agreements, I would imagine if we said to Australia, we'd like to add this into the free trade agreement, it would be met with a big resounding raspberry on both sides. So I don't think this government is serious about these carbon tax adjustments. And for me, it is the number one tool that trading nations can use to encourage, again with sufficient support, development help, high carbon countries to decarbonize.
Okay, and is there a conflict, Claire, in terms of like trading agreements like that? You used Australia as an example there. There obviously you want trading agreements with them, but then if you start to talk about things like food miles and the integration of transport costs into carbon cost evaluations, that all pulls exactly the reverse and talks about let's make it in our own back garden as opposed to extending supply chains around the planet.
Yes, and actually it would be. Again, I'm not an economist and I'm not a trading expert. And the last thing you want to do is to be, propping up uncompetitive industries. But it seems to me if we have industrial clusters like the one led by Mayor Houchen in Teesside, who are making strenuous efforts to decarbonise and produce goods for the global market, those are more competitive if the fact that they're being made in a lower carbon environment is recognised. That is good for local jobs. It is good for transport miles, and it's and it's good for the climate. It gives the other countries an incentive to decarbonise. So for me, it's a bit of a win-win whether you sit in the sort of free trading or some call it protectionist view of the continuum.
I think it's also a proper evaluation of the type of transport we're talking about. Mm-hmm. If you could bring it by ship a long way, and it might be about which port it comes into the UK in. So, for example, if it's going to Mayor Houchen's in the port of Tees, as opposed to arriving in London and getting trucked up on the road, it's whole cost evaluation.
Exactly. This is very important. And if I may flag for the committee's attention, so this is the other thing about the sort of the rhetoric versus the reality. So we've made great noises about the shipping industry, the global shipping industry moving to a much better place, and there's a lot of innovation. The International Maritime Organization's meeting in the UK a couple of weeks ago did not suggest this was an industry serious about decarbonising. So again, these proof points, as opposed to what people say, are what really matters. And it's the same with the country's NDCs, what is actually happening with their emissions. We have to keep holding people to account with their plans and their targets.
I could talk to you for some considerable time, Claire, but I think I'd better leave it there, Chair.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Claire, just the last question for me before we move on to our next panel. I'm interested in your comments you've been making today about how the UN process is very much about communiques, diplomacy, kind of getting some form of consensus and agreement, but you're talking about the kind of real-world implementation. The assumption's always been that countries therefore lead that conversation. I don't know if you had any reflections on the spending review last week and whether that is ambitious enough for meeting our own targets. But do you think there needs to be something else at the UN level around implementation? And if so, what do you think that should look like?
Yes, I do. Thank you. I mean, look, so I think the COP, I'm conscious of sounding negative about the COP, but if I can share with you, so I sat in all the way through the 2 weeks of negotiations in Madrid. I felt it was the right thing to do. And the COP is stuck on some particular issues. And I sat in one room where we were negotiating one of the sticky issues. We had 500,000 protesters assembled outside, and we spent 20 minutes of the hour just arguing over whether the meeting could be termed an informal or an informal. We waste hours of negotiating times on the colours of the grayscales in the reports that will support the Paris rulebook. It is shaming. I'm ashamed that we allow that to happen. And I think we have to inject that sense of transparency and urgency into the process and find a place for this real world ambition, action, desire to work together to come in. What I'd like to see, at the moment, of course, the COP presidency transfers to countries, and the president's agenda is whatever you sort of want to do. And so in Chile, the Chilean president, we had a big focus on the cryosphere, on oceans. It will fluctuate year to year. I think we need to embed the action agenda, which is where the real world stuff comes together, into the official part of the COP agenda. We need a reporting back moment every year where the pledges that are made by companies, by cities, by states is added up so we can see if we're on track or not. And we, thank goodness we've got the COP. It is the most massively important big tent moment for climate. It's wonderful that these countries come together, not to be underestimated, but we must use that to really force out not just ambition, but action. And the thing that always terrifies me is since we started this process in 1991, emissions from energy have more than doubled. So we have done an awful lot of talking and an awful lot of diplomacy, and that curve keeps going up inexorably. And if we don't pivot this curve in the next 5 years, then we are straight through 1.5, we're post 2 degrees, and we genuinely don't know what the world's climate looks like at this point. And that is why the desire to make the COP26 such an important moment is still so relevant and I think has to be shared. And if you can do anything to, spread that across government, I will be eternally grateful to you.
Well, thank you for that, Claire, and thank you for your time this morning. We appreciate you appearing before the committee. So thank you to you. We'll be now going to our second panel. So introducing our next set of witnesses, Peter Betts, who's an Associate Fellow at Chatham House and a visiting professor at the LSE, and for a long time was Senior Counsel to the Cabinet Office on COPs. Farhana Yamin, who is a lawyer and CEO of Track Zero, and the Vice Chair of Climate Vulnerable Forum Expert Advisory Group, and a Senior Advisor also to Systemic. Dr. Emily Schuckberg, who's the Director of Cambridge Zero and a Reader in Environmental Data Science at the University of Cambridge. And lastly, Dr. Jennifer Allen, who is a Lecturer in International Relations at the University of Cardiff. I think you've now all appeared on my screen. So I was a bit worried there. So we're delighted to have all of you with us this morning. You just heard, hopefully, the last question from Mrs. O'Neill there about the 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees kind of landing zone and what that might look like for the world. And Emily Schuckberg, if I come to you first, based on the emissions reduction pledges, the NDCs that we talk about in COP language, that have already been made, where do you think we're going to land? Are we going to hit 1.5, or are we landing more towards the 2+ degrees above industrial levels? Thank you.
Yeah, so after the Paris Agreement, obviously all countries associated with that put in their pledges, and at the time it was estimated that meant that we were roughly on course for something like 3 degrees of warming by the end of this century. Now, more recently, we've had some really positive announcements coming from China, their announcements of net neutrality by 2060. We have a president-elect in the United States who is suggesting that he's going to try to encourage a net zero by the middle of the century target for the US. So if we start to look at the potential pledges and the pledges that are coming in now, then that draws that number down closer towards 2 degrees, but still quite a long way away from the Paris Agreement commitment, which, let's remember, was well below 2 degrees with an ambition to reach 1.5 degrees.
And what does that mean in terms of kind of near-term impacts in the next 10 years? What does it look like for people when we talk about these temperature targets?
Well, we're already seeing the impacts of climate change here and now today around the world in terms of extreme weather events, heat waves, floods. We've seen wildfires causing devastation around the world in Australia and in California in particular. The greatest concern, if we're in that sort of 2 degrees up to 3 degrees or potentially more zone, is that low-lying coastal zones and islands become uninhabitable, that will see inland flooding that is destroying lives and livelihoods, extreme weather resulting in the breakdown of critical services, in death and disease, in the breakdown of food systems, severe water shortages. And many of those things are associated with migration, but also with conflict. So it's actually, critical set of impacts around the world that can come together. But the other thing that's of a real concern, if we're starting to reach those higher temperatures, is the risk of really catastrophic and potentially irreversible changes occurring. And the sorts of things that we're concerned about there are the vast ice sheets that cover Greenland and West Antarctica. Those hold within them huge stores of water, meters of sea level rise equivalent. And if we look to West Antarctica, for example, I used to work for the British Antarctic Survey, and we've been a British Antarctic Survey together with other colleagues around the UK and in the United States, have been conducting a field campaign looking at the Thwaites Glacier, which is a key part of that West Antarctic ice sheet. There's evidence that may already be in irreversible retreat. If that West Antarctic ice sheet collapsed, that would put us on course to many meters of sea level rise. There are other concerns, for example, about the melting of vast frozen stores of methane in the Arctic. Methane is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So all these things become a greater risk at the greater levels of warming.
Thank you. And Peter Betts, you were involved in a long time in advising ministers on these issues. What do you think would be an ambitious but realistic aim for COP26 to try to bridge this gap? Or you're on mute, Peter, I'm afraid. You'll just need to unmute yourself.
So sorry. Morning, and morning to everyone. So I agree with what Emily just said. I think the prospects for Glasgow and for raising ambition are much better than they were even 3 months ago. Slightly strange in this COVID world, but I think it's true. I think that the Chinese announcement is hugely significant. It's the first time that China has adopted a target which isn't just sort of the summation of what they're doing anyway, as it were. It's a top-down goal which is going to drive action in the Chinese system. So I do think that is very significant, as Emily said. I think the new US administration is very important, both because US is the second biggest emitter and will need an ambitious commitment, and because the US will use its heft, as it did before Paris, to put pressure on other emitters, its allies, to bear down on their emissions. I think the EU is in a pretty good place. And I think we'll adopt probably a 55% target later this month. So, and you've got countries like Colombia, who had a very modest intent for their NDC revision, for their target revision, has just announced a much more ambitious target than people thought. So, I think we can get a very substantial set of commitments in the right environment. We've seen the Chinese long-term goal. We haven't seen their NDC yet. That matters more than anybody else, of course. So, I think we can get a very substantial step up in ambition, and what we'll need is to if we can't get all the way to 1.5 degree trajectory, what we need is to harness all those real economy trends the previous speaker referred to. We need to think about how we build pressure for urgent further action after Glasgow.
And again, on the previous panel, it was suggested we ought to be focusing on 3 or 4 things, and trying to get those done really well at COP26. What would be your number 1 top priority in the context of your answer just now?
So I do think NDCs are the most important, but they need to be tied with other action, which is going to accelerate further action. So, long-term goals are an important part of the picture, long-term net zero goals. I think that the work that Mark Carney has been leading on really internalizing risk into investment decision-making, I think that can have a huge impact, and we're seeing these shifts in decisions that are being made by companies and governments all the time. And I do think the big coalitions that have been put together on things like electric vehicles can have a powerful impact on mitigation. What we must not lose sight of course, is many vulnerable countries are extremely concerned about impacts on them. So we do also need a very strong resilience and adaptation package for those countries. And I think the UK has great strength, both in the public and private sector, in that area, and we should really exercise leadership in that space.
Thank you for that. I'm going to come now to Paul Howell, please. Paul.
Thank you, Chair. I'll start with yourself, Jennifer. What I'd like to talk around is, in terms of COP26, and what countries and country groups should the government be focusing on for its diplomacy? Is it the big movers, the Chinas and the States, or is it about full inclusivity, or is it something around the combination thereof? I'll let you talk from there, and then I'll come to others.
Thank you, and good morning. It's about inclusivity. The phrase used very often in negotiations is that it's a party-driven process. So leaving out countries because we don't seem to think they're important, maybe small island states or least developed countries, can undermine the quality of decisions that are taken, but also undermine the likelihood that any decision will be adopted, because every country has equal say. All decision making is done by consensus. So I would say certainly the Small Island States Alliance, AOSIS, least developed countries, and a coalition in Latin America called ILAC would be some key partners to work with.
And can you see that as more important than hitting the big numbers of China and the US?
Well, we're going to get China and the US regardless. They will certainly tell us what they think. And I think what they do matters extremely, and the relationship between those two countries matters. It was key to getting agreement in Paris. But we can't forget those smaller countries. They use the media increasingly if they feel they're being left out. So we saw that in Chile, Madrid last year. They also have blocked decisions if they felt that they weren't ambitious enough or if they were left out of the decision-making process.
Okay. No, thanks for that. Can I just broaden the conversation and bring Farhana in for that as well, please?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to this session. I've worked very closely for a group of countries, 48 now in number, who represent 1 billion of the world's population, and they're called the Climate Vulnerable Forum. The Climate Vulnerable Forum was set up, actually with British support initially, in the run-up to COP15, which was back in 2009 in Copenhagen. That was the COP that collapsed. It was meant to adopt what was now the Paris Agreement. We had to wait, five more years to put the global negotiations back on track because there was such lack of consultation with the vulnerable countries. The 1.5 degree goal was put forward at the Copenhagen conference by over 100 countries, including the Climate Vulnerable Forum countries. And so it's actually 11 years to the day that almost that conference collapsed amongst acrimony. And one of the chief achievements of the vulnerable countries at Copenhagen was to reference the 1.5 degree goal in the Copenhagen Accord, the 2.5 pages that we managed to adopt then. And I'm saying this historically a little bit because I do see a real danger in some of the mistakes that we had learned from being repeated as we focus on the EU and China and the US, as we abandoned, frankly, the concept that the COP president is, on the day that he or she is elected, an elected official representing every single party. And so the diplomacy, the ambition, the views, and the actual interests of all of those countries must be balanced and equally held. I'm also slightly appalled, I have to say, that the word realism is being used to deny the reality of where climate impacts already are, and that by 2030, we may already be breaching 1.5. So I want to reference the IPCC special report, which spelt out, again, many, many years later, in detail, the huge impacts, as Emily's already outlined some of them, I won't repeat them, but except to stress two that are very critical right now, which is water security and food security. So in the short term, apart from the impacts that she suggested, over the longer term, such as sea level rise and collapse of major ecosystems such as the West Antarctic ice sheets and so forth, which we are imperiling as we delay and as we risk that narrow window of keeping to climate safety. And that is not a nice to have. That is what I'm slightly concerned, that the committee and everyone watching and all of the MPs don't think that 1.5 is some nice to have. We are beyond that conversation. We need to understand that realism involves understanding why the world's scientists, why the world's ecosystem need 1.5, and that requires us to be at net zero around 2030. So my very simple, manageable landing point, as Claire put it, for COP26 is net zero by 2030 is the new 2050. So 2030 is the new 2050. So that's all you need to remember. We have to phase out, especially in the richer countries, basically by 2030. And I hope that the UK will put forward an NDC with a clear plan which shows it's on track in the interim, in this next 10-year period, which it currently isn't. I hope it will put forward and follow the Scottish lead and put forward a target of something like 75% reduction, which is what we need for the UK to be aligned with 1.5 and for to have credibility as a COP presidency. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fan. I'll come back to the NDCs in a second, but in the meantime, just want to continue just on the discussion about inclusivity, getting involvement. And just if I could move the discussion on, and I'll take a few words from Peter, please. Just with regards to the challenges that's involved in getting high ambition and support from all of these different blocks or bodies or individuals. How do you address all of the changes? I'll come to Peter, then I'll come back to Jennifer just to build back from where we started, if that's okay.
I mean, just on if I've understood the question. So first of all, on the sort of scale of the challenge, I definitely agree with Farhana that we need to keep temperature increase below 1.5 degrees. If you look at what that requires on UNEP's sort of medium scenario, the world would need to cut their emissions by more than half from today's levels by 2030.
Sorry, Peter, just to interrupt, we'll go all over the place in the subjects, but it's really about how do we get the different countries and different blocks involved in this? How do we motivate them to participate, as opposed to what the actual target is at this point in the discussion?
Well, yeah. I think the EU is in a reasonably good place. I mean, maybe not reducing by as much as Farhana would like, but I think they will have a big step up in ambition. I think we should work closely with them. And clearly, the new US administration is going to have to come up with an ambitious number for themselves. It looks unlikely the Democrats will take the Senate, so they're not going to be able to get sort of full legislation through as they otherwise would have done, but we need a very ambitious reduction from them. China, who is the biggest emitter, has announced this very promising and ambitious and positive step of a net zero goal by 2060. We don't know if that's greenhouse gas or climate or CO2. That sounds techie, but it's really important for the scale. So I think there needs to be a conversation between a continued conversation between the EU and China and the US with the UK. So we do need some bilateral conversations with some of the really big emitters. I completely agree with Farhana. We need to work closely with vulnerable countries, and the UK has done that a lot over the years, probably more than any other developed countries, I would say. My experience as a leading negotiations for the EU was that if we didn't have the vulnerable countries in the room, we got a worse outcome for the climate, because the EU would essentially get squeezed between the EU and the big emerging economies towards a low ambition outcome. So we definitely need to work closely with the vulnerables, and that definitely means also responding on their asks and priorities. So I hope that gives a sense of how I think the UK from the outside should play it.
Okay, I'll come back to you in a second, Farhana. I just wanted to hear Jennifer's take on that, just in terms of, because we started about making sure we get everybody involved. How do you think that can be best levered through the COP26 event?
Previous presidencies have found it useful to engage their embassies quite extensively and have regular conversations with as many people in country as possible. I agree with Peter. Bilateral conversations with key countries and coalitions is useful, including, the French experience was also bringing in, at the time, Francois Hollande to be speaking with key countries and having a clear call with what's expected to bring countries up will be useful. Everyone is on board. They have NDCs. The question is, in what way we want those NDCs to be more ambitious. And that might be tailored to countries, because for some countries, it's unreasonable to be asking them to engage in reducing emissions when the key call really is building adaptive capacity. So working with those countries around that, I think especially in a post-COVID era, will be key.
Different things for different places. Farhana, yes, if you wanted to come back in there very briefly.
Yeah, engaging all of the countries means listening, and that is one of the key skills of a COP presidency. The developing countries are also looking to this COP for a full delivery of the finance package that was agreed in Paris and had the 100 billion pledge, basically, which has not been met and is still very inadequate from the point of view of only 20% roughly is going to adaptation, and a very small amount of that, only 14%, is going to least developed countries. Most of the money is still going on mitigation and to richer countries within the developing countries, middle income countries and so forth. So I think from the point of view of what is needed for countries to go away from Glasgow feeling that it was worthwhile to come and that they haven't come yet again to sign, frankly, a sort of another suicide note and applaud the COP for doing that. That is what the countries I work with felt at Paris, and the financial aspects, the inclusion of loss and damage in the Paris Agreement, and the raising of ambition parts of Paris is what gave them hope. So when they're coming to Glasgow this time, all of those elements must be fulfilled. All of the NDCs must be tabled. The fact that the UK, we still don't know when exactly they will table it and what exactly it is a source of regret, and has actually slowed down and confused the date by which everyone else is submitting their NDCs. So I think that diplomatically, the UK is not giving clear leadership signals. I was watched the ambassadors of the climate vulnerable countries and a very senior representative of the UK saying the timing of the NDCs wasn't important, it was their ambition. That's not the case. The Paris Agreement is very clear. The process for this year is very clear. Midnight, December 31st is the deadline. And that is what the vulnerable countries are asking every country to admit, the most ambitious NDC, because it's seen as a survival deadline. And it's not those countries that are not submitting their NDCs. It's the larger countries which before COVID struck had not raised their ambition and had not got the preparations in hand to submit their NDCs this year. So we've already had a 9-month delay, and that isn't a welcome delay at all. That is seen as an appalling delay that has happened. And it should be made good very swiftly with every single country submitting their NDC by December.
Okay, I'd like to think that progress was made on that. I'll go through the NDCs now and then come back to another couple of points I had earlier. Emily, would you like to contribute to the view on NDCs in terms of the timing of things and the importance that the UK gets its leadership in place by establishing its position?
Well, no, I mean, of course, the NDCs, as everyone has said, are critically important. And the UK, holding the presidency of COP, has a particularly important role in terms of setting its NDC. And of course, it will be the first NDC that we ourselves as a country have put forward outside of the European Union. So that also holds an important point. So I think I just endorse what everyone else has already said, that it is going to be a very important announcement, and that we show both fairness and ambition in terms of our commitment is going to be very important.
And do you think that there's any policy changes that are going to be needed to make sure that we actually make whatever we put out there as a deliverable NDC target?
Well, I mean, we've recently heard the 10-point plan from the government, which obviously speaks significantly to that. I mean, actually, just today, Sorry,
I apologise for interrupting. Is that enough, or do we need more?
Yeah, so just today, the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group, together with Cambridge Economics, put out a study where they had estimated that that 10-point plan would be consistent with reducing emissions by around about 59% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. So nothing quite as ambitious as the levels that Farhana was indicating would be would be desired. And if our ambition is to keep temperatures at that 1.5 degrees level as a maximum warming, then the science really does say that we need to be reducing, as Peter said initially, we need to be halving our global emissions by 2030 over the next decade. And it really is beholden on the developed countries to contribute very significantly to that reduction.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And just coming back round, in terms of the questions I started with, really, just in terms of countries' engagement and things, I would just like an observation, which I think is probably a fairly obvious one, as to the impact you think the change in the US president has made to the actual tone and of the whole COP26 agenda. Do you want to just continue, Emily, and then I'll just take quick comments from others?
Well, I mean, the most important thing probably is that the current US president had said that the US was going to withdraw, or has withdrawn the US from the Paris Agreement. And, I think hopefully we'll see a reversal of that. And if the US can reposition itself in a leadership role in terms of encouraging not only its own ambition, but encouraging ambition of other countries around the world, then perhaps we might be seeing a turning point in terms of actually a global response to climate change.
Thanks, Emily. And Farhana, if I could just finish off with yourself, but just throw another point in at the same time. Obviously we seem optimistic that the US is moving in the right direction in terms of that, but do you think that the UK is sending wrong messages by dropping the aid number from 0.7 to 0.5?
Absolutely. That's one of the things I wanted to highlight, that while some, many good things were signalled in the Green Industrial Package, the 10-point plan, many other things in terms of money are sending the opposite signals, both on what the UK spends on domestically, going ahead with massive road building, only giving 12 billion, frankly, compared with the 30 billion and the 40 billion that the French and Germans have put forward in terms of the Green Recovery Package. So I think our spending domestically is not on target. And the final sort of insult, frankly, to the credibility of the UK saying that they want to encourage a fulfillment of the Paris Pledge is for the UK itself to cut its 0.7 target, saying we cannot afford it at this point and we cannot justify it to the British people at this point in time. I really hope that Alok Sharma and that all of the MPs who were appalled by that decision reverse that in time for the COP when it convenes, and that we go back to being a world leader in terms of recognising that both COVID and climate chaos that is already locked in for 2030 is going to lead to hundreds of millions of people being in poverty, additional to what we were expecting.
Thanks, Fiona. And if Pete, I think you were asking if you could come in, and maybe a comment as to, obviously the government has also said it's going to double its international climate finance and spend 11.6 billion between 21 and 25. As to what contribution that, the significance of that.
Yeah. So I'd like to talk to that because I agree with Fiona, but maybe just on the US first, very briefly.
Sure.
So I think the US change of administration is hugely significant. Firstly, because the US will have a target, and so having the second biggest emitter having a target does, change the politics for other countries to show ambition. Secondly, because I think the US will put pressure on all of its allies, Japan, Canada, Australia, and others. I also think they will engage bilaterally at the highest level with Mr. Modi, as Kerry and Obama did before Paris. And I also think that it's not all about the COP. We have many global processes which can be driven much more effectively if you have the weight of the US behind you. If you want to reform the way the multilateral development banks or the IMF works and how it incorporates climate, if you want to have a global process on countries thinking about green recovery and embedding that in their recovery programs when they come, thinking about debt for developing countries, you need the US on side. China is by far the biggest creditor country, and they charge near commercial rates of interest, and they don't by and large do debt cancellation. So we need to try and further drive that conversation up, in my view, and I think the US makes that much more possible. On finance, I do think reducing the 0.7 to 0.5 is a really bad signal and will weaken the UK's authority at this time. I think that the UK has been strong in this area. We have not just spent the 0.7, but we have prioritised adaptation. We have prioritised the poorest. We have had a much higher proportion of grant than others. And we're in a position where it looks likely that developed countries collectively, as Fiona said, will miss the 100 billion. And we are in the business of banging the table to get other donors to do more. This is not a good signal, and it also is a bad signal to our allies in the vulnerable countries. So, I think, reversing or at least limiting to 1 year, I think anything the committee can do to sort of bring that to Minister's attention would be very valuable.
Okay, I think also it would be quite interesting if, we look at, we've dropped from 0.7 to 0.5, but if everybody was at 0.5, we'd all be in a better place. And we start with the big numbers. I'm really getting pressed on time, and I know Emily had put her hand up, Chair, so I'll take a final comment from Emily, and then I'll move it back to yourself.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up a little bit on, we've been talking about green recovery, and I just wanted to emphasise that there's a lot of evidence now that investment in terms of green measures, as we're all, not just in this country, but around the world, looking to recover from coronavirus, brings significant returns. And so it's estimated that for each percentage point of GDP that you invest in green measures, you could be expected to ultimately receive 2 to 3% increase in GDP. And so, and that rises because of the benefits in the short term in terms of green jobs, but also the benefits in the longer term in terms of increased productivity and investing in assets that are more sustainable and more resilient into the future.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for that. I'm going to come to Mark Pawsey now, please. Mark.
Thank you, Chairman. And Emily's remarks lead on to the issue I want to talk about, which is COVID and the impact of that and the green recovery. We know that, COVID has delayed COP26. It's gone back a year. And we know in the past 12 months, emissions haven't increased at the rate they might have done as a consequence of COVID. Can somebody, perhaps Jennifer, just confirm to us the position we find ourselves in? World Meteorological Organization have said that emissions have continued to grow to a record high, but they're less high than they might otherwise have been. Can you just tell us what the impact of COVID has been before we look at the measures to deal with it?
In terms of emissions, we've seen a blip where they go down, and then, as you would expect, perhaps, as lockdown measures ease, they go back up. Ultimately, the reduction in emissions won't make a big difference because they're not structural emissions. You can imagine it's like every day is a weekend, essentially. So it's about 15% reduction, which shows just how much of our emissions are actually locked into the system. Even when we're all at home, we're still emitting 85%.
And is that worldwide, or how does the UK compare?
I believe those are UK, but actually Emily is probably in a much better position on this than I am.
Okay, Emily, how have our emissions compared over the last 9 months compared to the rest of the world?
So I don't have the exact figures, I'm afraid. I think the 15% that Jen mentioned is probably the largest reduction we saw at any point in terms of those global emissions. My understanding is more likely the year will end up with something like 7% reduction in terms of global emissions. And I think there's two really important things to recognise there. The first is that that's emissions, and what the climate responds to is concentrations of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And our concentrations of carbon dioxide are edging up towards 415 parts per million for this year. And that is just vastly outside the range that we've seen in the historic past. You have to go back 3 to 5 million years at least to find carbon dioxide levels as high as that. Continuing to rapidly increase. And the second important point is that sort of scale of emissions reduction is the sort of scale that we need to be having, not just in 1 year, but for every single year of the coming decade and beyond, if we are to be on course for reaching globally net zero emissions reductions by around about the middle of the century. And the challenge is going to be how we persist in those emissions reductions in a planned way rather than in the unplanned way that we've been experiencing over the last 9 months. And that really does mean that we need to be seeing structural changes that lock in those sorts of emissions reductions.
Yes, and you spoke about that when you said that a green recovery would lead to a higher GDP than if we don't apply green principles, as the Prime Minister's brought forward his 10-point plan. So just flesh out for us why a green recovery. I mean, we can increase economic activity by digging holes in the ground and filling them up again. Why should a green recovery entailing changing the way we do things necessarily bring about the increased economic activity and increased GDP?
Well, I think the key thing that we're looking at in terms of a recovery, there's probably three things that I would say are really important. We want to create a more resilient future because the last thing we want to do is set ourselves up for another one of the sort of disasters that we've seen over the last year. We want to create a more sustainable future and actually also a more inclusive future as well. And together, green recovery measures can support each of those different elements. So we know that currently, not just in this country but around the world, there is the first impacts that we're really seeing affecting people's lives are the impact on jobs. And if we're wanting to look to how to set up an economy that's fit for the coming decades, then we want to be investing in those jobs that are going to be fit for the coming decades. And it's very clear that the trajectory that we are on, where the real opportunities are in terms of green jobs. I come from the University of Cambridge, and there is, around the university, there is huge, exciting research going on in all the green technologies of the future, whether that's in terms of battery storage technologies, whether it's in terms of looking at new construction materials to replace concrete and steel with more natural construction materials, whether it's looking at new forms of clean transport. There's a big program here looking at how we can deliver carbon zero aviation, for example. There are huge, exciting opportunities, and that's where the jobs of the future are going to be. So if we can invest now, not just in the jobs, but also in the skills and training to support those jobs, then that's where we'll see those long-term benefits. Okay,
and you've referred to manufacturing, but we have a very service-based economy. How can we make our service-based economy greener? And how will that help?
Well, part of that is about creating a more circular economy. It's about, the very common sense thing of if you just waste less, then that's, just a common sense good thing to do. That is feeding into our creating a more sustainable economy at the same time. The other thing that I think is really important and probably was somewhat less addressed in the 10-point plan than the straight technological side of things. The other aspect that's really important is looking to support nature. That's another area where we could be investing in significant new jobs, in perhaps supporting a new national nature service, for example. One of the things that I think that many people have really appreciated over the last 9 months is the benefits of being able to experience our natural world, going out into green spaces and actually being able to benefit from nature in that sense. But nature itself can be deployed to help tackle the climate challenge. And it can be, we can look to be restoring our peatlands, for example, which can either be, if not treated well, a source of carbon emissions. But if we look to restore them, they can be actually acting as a sink of carbon emissions and helping us reach those carbon targets.
And Peter, if I might turn to you, what's your view of the measures that the government has announced to build a recovery post-COVID? And are the objectives that the government set sufficiently in line with climate ambitions? And how do we sit in relation to other countries in the world? Is our ambition to use COVID as an opportunity greater than other areas, or are there other countries that are moving faster than we are?
If I may, could I just say a few words about what this means internationally first, and then come to the UK?
Of course.
So what matters more than anybody than what we do, is what the emerging economies do, of course, as others have noted. And increasingly, we have a development path that's available for countries which is low carbon, which is not more expensive. Renewable energy is increasingly cheaper than fossil fuels. Electric vehicles will soon be cheaper. So we're not asking countries to do something that is against their interest. There are often major sort of political economy and other barriers to moving in that direction. The second thing is that lots of countries around the world are thinking about stimulus packages anyway for sort of macro reasons. I'm not an economist either, but we need to get the economies rebooted. There has been a lot of stimulus, a lot of spending so far. A lot of it has rightly been on health, on propping up incomes and so on. But as we move out of the crisis, then there is a focus on how do we reboot the economy. And I completely agree with Emily that how that money is spent is hugely significant. And if countries essentially go back into the high carbon economy, they're going to lock themselves into stranded assets. And we have to try and have that argument and win that argument with them. So, I think the analysis has been done. I think Vivid Economics did some analysis that suggested that most stimulus packages so far have not been very green globally. Europe, I think Germany, France, the UK, the EU were a bit of an exception. They weren't wholly green, but they were more green than neutral, as it were. So I think we have done a little bit better, but I do think there's a lot further to go, and we need to try to persuade some of the big countries internationally. China. I'm not demonizing China; they're a very big economy, but they are building new coal, and we need to, and they're building it at home and abroad, and we need to try to build the case as to why they should build other kinds of infrastructure. I mean, they will manufacture it anyway, whether it's coal plants or whether it's renewable energy, it will be manufactured in China. So it's at least as much a political economy choice for them as a straight commercial economic choice.
Thank you. And I can see Farhana wants to come in. But Farhana, could I ask you this, really picking up on Peter's point there, how do we encourage developing economies and including China to go down a greener route? I mean, we can always say, look at us, aren't we wonderful, we're doing the right thing. But how could we get China to be investing in renewable energy to use more wind power than to encourage the development of coal as a fuel in the countries where they have their own country and where they have influence?
I think the short answer is by example. When we stop subsidizing fossil fuels, when we absolutely raise the share of renewables to its very maximum, when we put more into the green recovery part of the stimulus package than not, then others will follow. You don't have to worry about
we're doing that, aren't we? And the evidence is that others aren't following.
Say what is not happening, and Peter and Emily hinted at that, but let me be more blunt. Around double the amount of money is going into the dirty business as usual economy, the economy that has got us to the ecological precipice point. 205 billion is going to fossil fuel industries, broadly speaking, and 135 billion to essentially the clean economy. And
so this is around the world?
This is one of the trackings that's done. WRI have got more figures. So we are still going in the wrong direction very fast. So the point I wanted to make is actually we are still in the UK, I'm sitting here in London, at the heart of the global finance economy. We have a huge leadership role. I hope Mark Carney and many others who have been trying to get finance to essentially divest from the old economy and invest in the new economy will speed up that. And we have got to ask the City of London, we have got to ask our banking sector, we have got to ask our investment community to stop funding the dirty stuff ourselves. That includes our banks, that includes our CEOs, that includes our pension funds, that includes our local authorities. We have to do that. And the more we do that, the Chinese, they will follow. They are looking more at what we do rather than, diplomatic efforts. And that signal that the end of the fossil economy is actually happened is the most important thing that we can do after Paris. Paris sent that signal that this is what we were going to do. We have to send that signal that we've done it and that the tide has turned in finance, in investment, in our pension funds, all of our money, follow the money, and we've got to do that as well. And I'm afraid that the UK spending round this week has not shown that. It has not shown a real understanding, and this is where I feel that the government needs a sort of cross-party approach to this. That's also one of the strengths of the UK, why the UK is why the Climate Change Act of 2008 happened, is this intense cross-party collaboration. We should get in everyone to come and give their time, give their talent. Gordon Brown, some of the Ed Miliband, some of the ministers who really played an outstanding role liaising with developing countries and understand global finance, can support, I think, the UK presidency team really rally around and have a very different atmosphere from the kind of atmosphere that we had in Paris and Copenhagen. I feel at the moment, frankly speaking, that we are on a train crash to Copenhagen. We're going to miss the 100 billion target. We're going to miss the 2-degree target by miles, actually.
But you do accept that the UK...
accept the reality that is facing vulnerable countries now of huge loss and damage mounting up and a massive debt crisis in the middle of it.
Okay, but
so you cannot see a successful outcome unless we really centrally understand the magnitude of that challenge.
But you accept that the UK is travelling in the right direction. Is it other countries that you'd like to see do more?
I think the UK isn't travelling in the right direction. It's going, we keep saying nice things like, we welcome this, we welcome that. But, it's too slow and it's too little and it's disjointed right now. And I hope that my testimony here can help ring the alarm bells of what the UK really needs to do to step up to this challenge.
Okay, and back to you then, Jennifer. Is what the UK are talking about in the 10-point plan, is that as we've heard from Farhana, inadequate?
I think what we need to look at is, rather than thinking about a 10-point plan that's disjointed from other announcements and other plans, is mainstreaming climate considerations across government and across the spending that we may need to do to restart.
And isn't that happening already?
Well, I'm not sure that the spending review necessarily supports that, given that we're building roads which create fewer jobs than, say, retrofitting homes to be more energy efficient.
Doesn't building roads enable goods to get to market and stimulate employment and GDP?
If they're open enough and we're not all stuck in our cars in a traffic jam.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you. I'm going to come now to Alexander Stafford. So, Alex, please, over to you.
Thank you very much. Some questions to Emily. Really is about COP and public awareness of the importance of COPs. So, in your view, how much do the public do know about COP, and even more, how much actually care? Because we talk about it a lot, it's important to talk about it, but the wider public, what's your view on how they view COP?
Well, I mean, I suspect that you don't need me to tell you that most people probably haven't even heard of COP26 or know what on earth it means. I mean, I'm sure that you all who speak to your constituencies, and the last thing that they trips off their tongue is COP26. Whilst there's broad awareness in the public around climate change, and there was a recent survey by YouGov that said 87% of people said that they broadly understand climate change. When you start getting into the more jargon associated with it, so net zero, for example, many fewer people really understand what that means. Some 36% of people or something. I suspect that over this coming year, well, I certainly hope that over this coming year, then people will become much more aware of the fact that we in the UK are hosting the next big climate conference in Glasgow next year. It's quite evident, and I've conducted studies previously looking at how people receive most information, and media, of course, is a significant source of information for many people. The media, rather understandably, has been very dominated by stories of COVID over the last year. Let's hope that we're moving out of that, and we'll do over the coming months, and we'll see an increased focus around climate change. But there is very strong concern in the population around climate change, and that's undiminished by the current COVID crisis. So again, similarly, YouGov polling recently showed that 2/3 of the population say that they're as concerned, if not more so, about climate change in the context of COVID.
Thank you. I guess the question is, do we need the public to be aware of COVID, of COP26? Is it important in your view, or is it more, it's a nice addition because obviously it's nice to talk about climate change? Does it make a single bit of difference in negotiations going on, whether the public know or don't?
I don't know. I mean, who knows whether or not it makes any difference to negotiations. I think that what is really important, though, and it comes back to some of the points that have been made already about inclusivity, and actually some of the points that Claire Perry was making in her witness statement in the previous panel, that I do think it is really important that the broader public are included in these discussions. This is something that, as we full well know, is an issue that is going to affect all of society, and not just today's society, but future societies as well. That we ensure that that people in this country and around the world are represented and included in those negotiations that are going to be so central to shaping their futures is critically important from a fairness perspective, but also from an efficacy perspective. At the end of the day, these big, grand global targets are going to be implemented on the ground in communities, affecting people's lives and livelihoods. And so it is essential that people are involved in the decision-making associated with that.
Yeah. I think looking back to other big events we've hosted recently in the UK, the Olympics being the obvious one, there's always around the Olympics, there's a big buzz about the legacy of the Olympics and the why we're doing it, and there's that big train. Is there going to be a legacy in the UK anyway on the public's engagement with climate change? And should that be a key aspect of how the UK engages with COP26? Should there be a sort of legacy, and what should that be?
I think there's a huge opportunity for the UK to use this, and it would be, if we weren't delivering that associated with hosting the COP, then I think we would be really missing something. In the university sector, and Jen can speak about this as well because she's part of this, we've created a network of UK universities to help support our activities over in the run-up to COP26, and we hope actually beyond that as well. And one key element of what we're doing there is focusing on wider public engagement, recognising that universities across the country are very important parts of their communities in the towns and cities in which they're located. And so we have been looking at what, over the course of the next 12 months, what local engagement activities we can help support to bring in a much wider community. In Cambridge, we just hosted it was virtual, unfortunately, but but a virtual climate change conference where we had a huge number of community groups engaged in that. There was a huge interest from the community to be engaged and talking about these issues. So I really hope that this is an opportunity. And the other voice that I think is really critically important that we're similarly actually trying to empower through this universities network are the youth and student voices. We've seen in this country and around the world how much enthusiasm there is from young people to make their voices heard around this topic, which of course is so central to their futures. And so I think making sure that we are engaging them, but more importantly, empowering them to make sure that their voices are heard in the run up to this is also, this big climate conference is also really important.
Great, thank you. And I think
add one example. So, although most of my life has been in these COP meetings, the biggest learning that I've done in the last year is to support community-based groups taking forward climate action, not just education and not just through campaigns, and to embed that in the high streets. So in Camden, we, with the support of Camden Council, took over a disused cafe and converted it into a pop-up climate action hub, which brought together the social justice people. It brought together all of the local groups. And I think that model, which is called Think and Do, because everyone has to think and do something differently, is a really good example. And Camden have said that they will roll it out across the whole of Camden. But I would like the UK as a legacy, every high street and every village should have a think and do space where climate action, social action come together and people discuss that. That would be a fantastic legacy for every single high street to reflect what Paris and the Sustainable Development Goals mean over the longer term, and for the COP26 not to just come and go as a sort of circus and leave nothing behind, but that we should embed climate emergency actions on our high streets, converting disused premises, which will also create a local sense of community as well as local jobs. So that's what we're trying to do, and I hope that we're working on that at the moment, and it's something that would be exciting for the COP26 presidency team to talk about.
Thank you. And just one last really question, I guess, to Emily probably about this, is about government. Over the last year or so, the government's had to communicate a lot more than probably ever any other time about COVID and complex missions and what we're doing and all that stuff. What lessons can be learned from the COVID crisis can we put to the climate crisis about communicating with the public and making sure messages are known and understood? A common aspect is that, both with regard to COVID and with regard to climate change, then, there is a need to communicate quite complex scientific information. So to the extent that there are lessons that can be learned around that, then that's very important. I think one of the key aspects that we've learned over the course of the last 9 months, nine or more months even now, is the importance of transparency, of being really open with all the information and statistics. So that's clearly critical. But I think actually it mostly comes back to the last question that we just spoke about. One of the things that I think has been a key lesson from the last 9 months is the importance of communicating in ways that are relevant to particular communities. And I think that, and really engaging those communities in the decision-making process, as we've just been discussing. So much of how we actually go about implementing climate change is going to be done at a local community level, as Farhana has just been giving some examples of. And so I think that bringing that communication down to that local level is going to be a key element of how we effectively deliver net zero as a country. And so if there's a key lesson from the last few months, I think it's probably that. Great, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Alan Brown now, please.
Thanks, Darren. If we go back to the practical preparations and coordination for the COP26 conference, And Jennifer, if I come to yourself, do you think the presidency is on track with its practical preparations for the conference? And is there anything particular that would maybe give you cause for concern?
Well, it's definitely, I'd give a different answer a few months ago. It's a very difficult thing to do right now because these COPs involve 25,000 people or more. And people coming from all around the world, not just diplomats that could easily be vaccinated, but community leaders, mayors, business leaders. And so in less than a year's time to invite that sort of number to Glasgow, I think will be very difficult, even with vaccines. So I know that the presidency is in conversations with the Secretariat. There are also think tanks that are doing analyses of various online meetings held at UN bodies to sort of get lessons learned. But I think what we need soon is clarity on how the meetings will be scaled back, who will be invited, and how to ensure that inclusivity, given that fewer people will be coming to Glasgow than originally anticipated.
And if we take a step back, pre-COVID, do you think the presidency had been on track to be able to put in place a successful COP had it been held in the planned timescale, without the events that happened?
I think all the contracts were in place, the venues were secured. There was, it does feel like a long time ago. If I remember correctly, there were conversations about how much of the venues could be used for the COP versus profiling some of the UK and Scotland's activities. But I think, on a very practical level, a lot of logistics were in place. If this is something that the UN does very well, it's the traveling show that is COP.
Okay, and if you look at the kind of bigger coordination and diplomacy type picture, from your observations, do you think the government is coordinating effectively with its presidency partner Italy and with the devolved administrations and perhaps Whitehall, obviously with some scathing observations from Claire O'Neill, but wondering if you can give a perspective from looking at it with your view of international relations?
I've actually never seen an arrangement like the UK has with Italy before. So this idea of co-hosting is a bit unique. Usually one country will do a pre-COP and then the other country will do the COP. And those are coordinated but relatively separate. So this is a bit unique. It seems like there's regular conversations happening, and that's useful. It's a bit unclear, though, what exactly Italy will be bringing beyond the pre-meeting. I can say from my position in Wales that the Welsh government would like to have a little more regular conversations about the COP with the UK government.
Okay, and any suggestions what effective coordination would look like, particularly with the partner presidency Italy?
I think it will depend a lot on when we can actually have meetings. So there's always a subsidiary body meeting that happens 6 months before COP. And that's very important to move issues forward. And that hasn't happened yet this year either. So the pre-COP is very important to coordinate with Italy because that's when ministers kind of pre-discuss a lot of the issues, and it can really help lay the groundwork for a successful COP. So I think regular communication and a very clear set of shared 2, 3, 4 asks of ministers to bring them on board with a small set of important issues will be important with Italy.
Okay, it's been suggested the UK might publish their nationally determined contribution on December 12th. How important is that as a building block going forward?
It's vital. If there's one thing that a presidency needs is credibility. No party will publicly say anything against the COP president, but as Peter said, I think earlier, our job as COP president is to be banging on the table to get countries to do more. And we can only do that if we've done it ourselves.
Okay, thanks. I'm conscious of time. I've directed these questions to Jennifer. Does anybody else feel an urge to comment on that? Hannah?
Yeah, well, I've been to 22 of the last 25 COPs, including the first COP, and it's normal for there to be coordination issues, turf issues, ego issues. So we shouldn't beat ourselves too much about that. I think the most fundamental thing is real leadership means listening to what those 194 parties want to happen at this COP, and to recalibrating and rebalancing the agenda, the official agenda, as well as the thousands of people who are contributing in other ways, including, CEOs, the finance industry, and so forth. And I think that it's not clear to me that the UK presidency currently has a handle on what is the official core business of the COP this year that it must deliver, what it has to get right and hand over to essentially what will be the African presidency and the Asian presidencies that will come in COP27 and COP28. No COP presidency ever solves all of the issues that require attention. And I think I'm not sure that they've got a real handle on that. And I think the core thing that people are looking for is the NDCs, which are supposed to be admitted by the end of this year. And if those are not adequate, which will be shown in February of 2021 in the synthesis report that the Secretariat has, what is it that the UK presidency will be able to do to put us on track to the Paris goals, finance, adaptation, and ambition towards 1.5 and the 2-degree target? So that for me is not clear that they really understand what to do in February of next year and the run up to the pre-COPs and the subsidiary body meetings. Why do we need heads of state? Is it that they're going to increase their own NDCs that they submitted 9 months ago, or are they going to launch yet more new things? Are the market rules, essentially the market-based mechanisms that are they going to negotiate those? I don't think so. Are they going to put more money on the table? It's not clear to me that the presidency team at the moment really understands those very big picture things. And I kind of feel, as an outsider, from what it looks like to us vulnerable country folks, that people are waiting really for the Brexit to happen before figuring it out, and that will be leaving things quite late. And I hope that there's not a second to lose, and that the December summit, which is coming in 2 weeks' time, helps give a real clear vision of what the UK will be doing in partnership with Italy. I think we need the Italians, because frankly, this will be the first time next year where we have to do so much of the diplomatic heavy lifting on our own and not with the EU. And that is an additional challenge. So the quicker they can work out that relationship partners, the better.
Okay, and when is too late then? You're talking about February being critical. When is too late to actually pull things together in terms of these vital negotiations and understanding what the key asks are? Back to you, Farhana.
I think things will be a lot clearer when we get to February and March. There's many more diplomatic meetings that are smaller that take place, that are usually on the diplomatic calendar. And it will be absolutely vital to bring the vulnerable countries, broadly speaking, 100 countries, into the heart of the negotiations, because they're the ones who, in the end, push for the highest ambition. They are, the canary in the coal mine. It is they who have the ecosystems that are most critical. And so they are the driving force of the credibility of the process. So if they're not included, and if the issues that they're raising right now are not included and discussed in those meetings, then I think this inclusivity narrative will fail. Just one example. So again, the 48 countries of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, chaired by Bangladesh, is prioritizing loss and damage as a major topic for COP26. The Youth Coalition, which just had its mock meeting now, have written a letter. This is the global youth of the world, saying the same thing. So when I say that the most important thing right now is for the presidency team to be listening, that is what they should be hearing and thinking, how can we act on those demands? How can we make sure that we hear that demand and that we do something about it? We put it on the agenda, we make some progress to it, we hand over stuff to COP27 and COP28 that we can't manage to to do at COP26. And I don't really hear that at the moment. I hear a kind of climate realism denial that 1.5 is still a nice to have and that it doesn't really mean anything, and a denial of the impacts that are already being felt in those countries, which will be compounded by what they are facing with the debt crisis, frankly, that is coming up, and the loans that they are going to have to start paying back. So those are the things which I feel need to be at the front and center of the diplomatic work right now, between now and March, and then we'll get to the technical negotiations in June, and I'm sure that there'll be many fights, but things do bed down, and I think it's still early days. But the COP team, I think, have all our support. They have all of the support of all of the parties, and they represent and are the officers of all of the parties. That's what I want to stress again and again. They have.
Thank you, Farhana. I'm sorry, we are officially running over on time, and I think Peter wants to come in. So, Peter, you've got about 30 seconds, maybe a minute.
Okay. So I agree with much of what Fiona says, but look, two things I think it's really important to understand about the COPs. The first thing is, these targets from countries may well have been put forward well before the COP. Now, I was the EU negotiator when we with the vulnerable countries wanted an ex-ante assessment, what was a fair contribution. We wanted a negotiation about draft NDCs that countries put on the table. We were fundamentally knocked back by a combination of the big emerging economies, the US and others. So, what we've had in the first round was NDCs put forward well before the COP, and that's it. So I think it would be great if we could get some kind of conversation about a collective ambition raising during the course of 2020 and 2021 rather, on the basis of the draft NDCs. I think that would definitely need a sustained push from vulnerable countries for that really to happen, because the big economies in the past, particularly big emerging economies, have been emphatic that once they put their number out, that's it. Second point I would make is, and that does have implications for the COP. A lot of the action could be over well before Glasgow happens. The second point I would make about the COP is it's not just about, having the COP presidency should not just be about the COP itself. It should be about how you use the platform and the authority that you have as COP president. The UK also has the G7 presidency next year. Our partners, Italy, have the G20 presidency. We've got the scope to push some really big issues, particularly if there's a positive US, in other fora. Some issues are better pursued in non-COP fora. If you want to talk about, debt, as Farhana mentioned, I agree with her, it's probably not something you're going to make most progress on in the COP. It's a finance minister's issue. If you want to have a process about green recovery and how you really get finance ministers to think about how they embed these considerations in their recovery programs, you need a finance ministry process. I completely agree with Farhana. We need to make sure vulnerable countries are part of all these countries in different configurations. But when Claire talks about trying to make the COP be the vehicle for everything, I'm not sure that's the right track. I think that there's really significant real economy action happening. Is that going to be accelerated by making it into another COP process? You can acknowledge it, you can celebrate it in the COP, but thinking how you might practically help it and reinforce that action through the COP is an open conversation. I personally would be open to ideas on how you could actually do it in a way that wasn't going to tie it in red tape and bureaucracy. But anyway, just that point, and I think this is also important for the public engagement point. A lot of those big decisions might have been taken well before the COP, so we need to think about how we engage the public around those decisions as well, not just that COP meeting.
Well, thank you for that, Peter. This committee is going to be scrutinising the COP process over the next year, so there'll be plenty more opportunities for us to speak on these issues as details emerge and we get closer to the COP conference at the end of 2021. So, as I say, we ran over a little, so thank you for bearing with us. Thank you to Peter Betts, to Farhana Yamin, to Dr. Emily Schuckberg and to Jennifer Allen for your contributions this morning. Thank you to